Now it's time for our keynote speaker. Dr. Adele Atkinson is a senior policy analyst within the OECD Financial Education and Consumer Protection Unit. And the next issue is National Strategies for Financial Education, the Toolkit and Network of OECD. Thank you very much.
Let me say thank you very much to all of you here for caring about financial education, to the hosts for inviting me, to Inter-American for hospitality. It's really been an amazing visit already, and I only arrived yesterday. And I'm going to stay till Sunday because it's my first visit to Athens. So I've been asked a couple of times how I would like you to call me. My name is Adele Atkinson. I do have a PhD, but in France we're not encouraged to call ourselves doctor. So I'm very happy to be Adele. I'm very happy to be Mrs. Atkinson. I honestly don't mind. But I'm always quite surprised now when people call me doctor because I've lived in France for 8 years, so that doesn't happen anymore. Okay, looks like we're ready to go. So, as you just heard, I'm going to talk to you especially about national strategies. Given what we've heard already today, I think this is exactly what Greece needs now. It's clear that you have the motivation. Unfortunately, it's also clear you have the need. And so I think to have a strategic approach, to have the buy-in from the high-level policymakers, from government, is extremely important. But I want to give you a little bit of a background first, and press a button, to give you some idea about why the OECD can talk about these things. So I'll give you a small, brief overview of the OECD's interest in financial education. Then I'll focus on national strategies. And I'll end by talking about some of the tools that we've been developing at the OECD. I encourage you, if it's something that you would like to know more about, to get in touch with me or to look on our website and to really explore what's possible. I'm afraid I came without business cards, so on my last slide, please do take note if you're interested in getting in touch. So, you might be surprised to know that the OECD's been working on financial education since 2002. This isn't a response to the crisis. This is a response to massive changes in the way that individuals have had to look after themselves in terms of planning for retirement, in terms of insurance, interestingly. And it was driven by two committees of the OECD, one on financial markets and the other one on insurance and private pensions. So you can see that for most of you in this room, the drive is actually exactly the issues that you're working on. And of course, the crisis drove increased interest, increased urgency, I can say. And as a result, we brought together those policymakers from around the world that were grappling with the same issues. And we created a network so that they could both physically and intellectually discuss these issues, come together, and try and find some common ground. So what we have now is a network that I will occasionally refer to as the INFI. It's our International Network on Financial Education. And it's constructed as well as a committee. It has an advisory board and a technical committee. But it has working groups of experts that come together to address particular issues, and you'll hear some of those as we go along. The idea of it is that as well as sharing good practice, it also creates research and data, and it addresses issues as they come up. So we're developing new documents. We're also developing policy guidance, policy toolkits to help countries to do things that have worked in other countries based on where their similarities lie. We also do some regional work. Unfortunately, we're not doing any in Greece at the moment, but we have these nice regional studies, and I think it's one of those things that just helps policymakers to focus on what's very specific about their region. And for us, it helps us sometimes to address topics such as financial inclusion, which is still a much bigger issue in Asia, for example, in Latin America. We never talk about financial education as being the way to solve the whole of the world's problems. We talk about it as one part of a multidimensional approach to empowering consumers. And this is also reflected by the G20's approach. So when we talk about financial education, we're also thinking about financial inclusion and, of course, regulation and consumer protection. So we these three high-level principles kind of illustrate that, but we always think about those things. I work very closely with my financial consumer protection colleagues, and everything that we do, we recognize the financial inclusion element. So I think we also need to keep that conversation going and not get so excited by financial education that we forget that a well-educated consumer is still going to face difficulties if they neither have access to the right products nor have the consumer protection framework in place to make sure they are properly protected. Here's a quick slide with a definition, but it seems to me that everybody that's spoken so far is very grounded on this, so I won't spend a lot of time. So basically, in English, the separation between education and literacy is we're talking about education as a process, and we're talking about financial literacy as either your current state or the end state that we might like, which together can create financial well-being. We do now have a definition for financial well-being, but it's not yet public, so watch this space. And one of the other things I wanted to flag that we have different levels of membership for our network. And even if your organization or authority isn't a full member, we also have symposiums. We have opportunities for you to come together, hear speakers, including from GFLEC, I heard was mentioned earlier. Anna Maria Lusardi will be speaking at this next event. It's actually a joint event with her research centre. Please do keep an eye on our website, and if you are interested and you're not able to access it automatically, send me a message and we'll try to get you in. I have to say that this one is already oversubscribed. The next one is in Moscow in October, but there are lots of opportunities, and I think it is a really nice way for you to see that you're not facing these issues alone. There's actually a conversation going on in practically every country in the world about how we can better support consumers. So let's focus on this topic of national strategies. Now, I'm not coming at this with an empty sheet by any stretch of the imagination. Policymakers very early on in the creation of our network recognized that it's one thing to talk about programs and initiatives, but really the whole point of policymakers is they have to be able to do something strategic. So they encouraged us to bring them together to work on creating outputs that would help other countries to create a national strategy. And as a result, we have several publications. These ones I'm highlighting because they were all backed by the G20. When we get backing from the G20 leaders, that shows that out of the multitude of things that they could have discussed and that they could have approved and that they could have endorsed, they recognize the importance of financial education. It's not insignificant, it's a major step. And while not every country is in the G20 leaders represent a vast majority of, well, maybe not a majority, around about 40% of global GDP, for example. So it's important to policymakers who want to fight for the case in their own country. And it's also important for us because it helps us to recognize when we're working in the right direction. So we have, on this slide, 3 completely different types of publication. The first one is our high-level principles, telling policymakers what they should do if they want to think about a national strategy. The second one describes how far countries had got to by 2013 in terms of implementing one. And the third publication is really much more practical, giving examples of how countries have done things, and it also has a checklist so that countries that have someone who is leading financial education can start to say, okay, we would like to create a national strategy. We should go through this checklist and see how far we are, what else we might need to do, and if there are any sticking points that we should address. And you can see that our policymakers didn't just talk about this. This is not just hot air. There's a huge change that's occurring. Since 2012, when maybe 20 or 30 countries were either in the process or actually had a national strategy, there's now over 70 countries within our network, and there may be 1 or 2 that are not in our network. So we're seeing also that countries are recognizing the benefit of the strategy they have, and they're starting to review, renew, replace, and create something that's continuously adapting to our modern world. We know that finance doesn't stay still. We know that the financial landscape is rapidly evolving, And the policymakers are not just saying this is impossible, they're saying we can do better. We are going to renew our strategy and we're going to move in the direction that's needed in the next 5 years. So it's a very exciting map in a lot of ways. We also have a definition for national strategies. I won't really read this out because the next slides will give you more detail. But again, just in case in the future you need to be able to say, this is what the OECD means by a national strategy, I thought it was useful for you to know that it exists. So, all of our work so far can be basically summarized in these 4 bullet points, which makes my life very easy. So, if you want to have a national strategy, you need to diagnose what's wrong in the country and how you might solve it. I've already heard, thanks to my interpreter, that there is some data here, perhaps not as much as you would like, but it's a starting point. And I've already heard that you have some understanding of the vulnerability of people. So that's an important first step in diagnosis. There also needs to be some kind of institutional and governing arrangement. This is very important, and I'll talk about it a little bit more. And then once you've got to that stage, some objectives against which you can evaluate. Otherwise, your strategy will just be hot air, unfortunately. And I think it's so easy to talk about a strategy, and it's so exciting to talk about the framework that sometimes we forget the content. And so it's also important that within this strategy and within this high-level political buy-in, there is also effective financial education, that it's innovative. And by that, I don't necessarily mean that you come up with the next design of some application, but just simply that it's light on its feet so that as things change, it can change as well. So when we talk about diagnosis, we talk specifically about data, really. We're talking about whether you have information on your population that you can use to identify particular target groups, particular issues, whether they be credit, whether they be retirement issues or saving in general or simple budgeting issues. And that data should be comprehensive enough that you can really start to talk to the population and to your stakeholders about the issues that Greece or whichever country you're working with is facing. And I think one of the easiest ways to do that is to create a specific survey instrument. We've actually created one at the OECD that many countries have used. However you choose to do it, whether you use ours or develop your own, I think there is some benefit in having a survey instrument that is entirely devoted to financial literacy, because as we've seen, it's a really complex thing. It isn't, you can't just simply say to someone, are you financially literate? You have to understand what they know. You have to understand what their weaknesses are. You have to understand whether they're applying what they know in the decisions that they take, whether they're even taking decisions or whether they're just procrastinating, and what kind of attitude are they going into their financial decisions with. Do they have the attitude that there's no point worrying about the longer term because there's too many things happening immediately? Or do they have a sense that they should focus on the long term? All of these things are so important and so difficult to capture with just 1 or 2 questions on another survey. On the other hand, once you know something about what you're trying to achieve, then 1 or 2 questions to help you track progress are very useful. So, on top of the data to tell you something about your population, if you're really being strategic about this, it's important to have some data on what's available for your population. And we call this mapping. And it's really hard in some countries to actually know what is available. We're doing it ourselves in one of the regional projects that I talked about. And it's incredibly difficult because a lot of stakeholders don't even recognize that they're offering financial education because that's not how they describe it. That's not how they think of themselves. So they might be offering debt advice, for example. But in that debt advice, they have follow-on where they help people to budget and to set up their lives again. Or they might be offering training to migrants in terms of understanding the new currency, understanding whether they have access to benefits or whether they can work. Again, it's financial education, but they're not necessarily the kinds of people that you will identify when you do a simple mapping. So sometimes what's useful is to have a call for evidence or to try to do localized conferences and seminars to bring in the interested people to see who they are. or just to ask people to tell you what they're doing rather than to go out there and say, are you doing financial education? Try to be imaginative so that you have a full picture, and try to identify if actually everybody's offering one thing, but there are huge gaps in terms of what is being offered. And the institutional, the governing arrangements, I think this is the most difficult thing to talk about in the abstract. It varies in every country. Every time I talk to a country or I go when they're launching their national strategy, I'm surprised by the complexity. And I think that's the key thing, really, that financial education has a lot of stakeholders, both in the policy world and outside. And so what's useful in most countries is for government to mandate that either an existing organisation or a group of organisations or a particular person, as is the case in Canada, actually is responsible and does have to do something. Among the countries that we know of with national strategies, this is the way that they've usually managed to get the resources they need, to get the long-term funding promises. The other way that countries do it sometimes is that they identify that financial education fits within an existing mandate of one of the authorities. So usually, most obvious one would be financial inclusion. So if an authority is already responsible for financial inclusion, they recognize financial education is a barrier and also potentially an enabler for people to become more included. And so they self-identify that they have this mandate. And that also can be effective. But it's really so different across different countries. Once somebody is in control, once somebody feels responsible, it's still important to coordinate, because there will still be lots of other authorities who have every right and every reason to want to be involved. And one of the things you don't want is to be giving mixed messages. So if you have one institution saying one thing and one institution perhaps saying it slightly differently, the population gets terribly confused and just thinks that nobody knows what they're doing, and so they stop listening. And that's exactly the thing we're trying to avoid. So we need to bring together the different policymakers and also the other stakeholders. And we need to really create a coordinated mechanism. That's really what we mean by a national strategy. That's where it differs from a comprehensive financial education offer without government backing. And of course, sometimes having this kind of coordinated approach means that you have to consider whether there are conflicts of interest. And it's always really, really important to make sure that consumers know whether they're receiving marketing or whether they're receiving education. Again, if you get that wrong, if you inadvertently take someone down a route where they feel obliged to buy a product, you could lose trust, and we know how important trust is. So all of these things have to be dealt with at the same time to really make it a strategic approach. So this slide gives you some of the stakeholders, and I realized as I was listening that one of the stakeholders that isn't on here specifically in its own bubble is the academic sector. And that's very interesting. And I can say for a fact that that is because we rarely have such detailed conversations with the academic sector as I've heard today. So this is something that when I go away, I think we need to rethink not just this slide, but our approach, because we do ourselves at the OECD work very closely with our research community, but our public authorities are not telling us that their research communities around them are an important part of the financial education puzzle. So that's very interesting. But anyway, just to look at this slide briefly. So of course I've talked about public authorities. Really, typically within a strategy, they're the ones that are leading the framework, they're setting the priorities. They're also quite often designing some kind of quality standards so that they can say, yes, this non-governmental organisation is doing something that's of the right quality and consistent with what we're trying to achieve, and therefore they can be counted as part of our strategy. Or no, they're not, and they do not fit within the strategy. The private institutions are working on financial education in all kinds of ways, and we're often the first. And they still have a very important role to play. I've heard today about social responsibility. It's incredibly important. It's also quite often the case that what they choose to do is come together in some kind of self-regulatory body or association to provide financial education that isn't specifically linked to one type of product or one type of provider, but is more generally addressing the issues that consumers might face. The other very useful thing about private institutions that are also financial institutions is they usually have a wealth of experience and the right type of education themselves, so they can make excellent trainers. Now, we all know that there's a difference between being a good teacher and being a good economist, but nevertheless, among those economists, there are good teachers. And that's also very useful, very important. And it's a resource that is sometimes underutilized. There's also a whole range of not-for-profits in the area of financial education. And again, some of them are working excellently, some of them not so. Some of them are just looking for the next funding stream, and you have to be very careful to make sure they're managed properly. Others probably know more about vulnerable groups than we ever will. They work with those people day in, day out that they've decided are their target group, and they understand the challenges as they come. Those challenges change all the time as well. So they're a very important group for reaching, for the last mile type of education. They're also an important group because they are trusted. And often one of the problems with vulnerable groups is that they've lost trust in other organisations, even educational organisations sometimes. So if they have stakeholders that they feel are there for them, that's very important. We wrote some guidance to try to avoid the conflicts of interest because our network said to us that it was one of the reasons they felt nervous of working with both some not-for-profits and some for-profits. So this is just a little summary of that guidance, but if you feel it would be useful to apply it or to show that you're applying it in your country, then please do look for it. So it recognises that stakeholders are necessary and also of benefit to a governmental strategy. And that, of course, they should disclose any possible conflicts of interest, and that they should try to come together to work through their associations. And it also, again, stresses the idea of some kind of code of conduct so that we can see that people are working within this code of conduct. And it asks questions, or it encourages you to ask questions such as, is a logo marketing? Now, some countries, they say, yes, it is, it's going too far. Other countries say, no, it's really important for people to understand that this is a trustworthy education coming from a trustworthy institution. I leave it open for you to discuss. We at the OECD haven't come up with a single answer to that, and it does very much depend on the financial market as well in the country. So we talked a little bit about the structure, and I mentioned to you that it's also important to set objectives so that you can evaluate against them. Some of that can be done through the data that you had and also through other policy discussions that are going on. It's important to be fairly specific when you set objectives. Having said that, if you're setting objectives that are quantitative and you're just doing it as a rule of thumb, be very careful, because if you fail to meet them, it can have knock-on consequences for the likelihood of continuing with a strategic approach. So I've seen in some countries, for example, where they say, we'd like to have an extra 7% of people saving. And there are so many good things about that, but there are also so many challenges, like where are those 7% coming from and how much do they have to save? And do they still have to have the savings at the end of the year? And is 7% enough? If only 2% were saving before, is it really going to make any difference? So be really careful about setting those objectives and trying to understand what is achievable and what is actually needed in order to justify having a strategy in the first place. And also, don't just rely on quantitative measures. Qualitative is also really important. It's really important to understand how you've changed someone's life. So it might be impossible to pay off your debt at the end of a year, but if you're on the road towards paying off your debt, and as a result you're sleeping better, as a result you're working a little bit better because your mind is less stressed by other things, then that's great. That is an achievement. And if you can capture those things through your stakeholders, through the data that you have from observing perhaps particular financial education programs, also see that as an important qualitative measure. So what about how to deliver financial education? We have a lot of publications on this. I've tried to summarize some of the findings on this slide, but I suspect you've probably all tried and thought about these yourselves. So one of the ways is sometimes you can reach people by capturing them at a time when they're actually open to the idea of learning. So it might be when they first when they get their first job. It might be as they move through the career ladder and take on new responsibilities. It might be having a baby, leaving a job, losing a job. It might be sickness. There are lots of times when people might be more open to learning a few financial messages than they would have been otherwise. And sometimes it's enough just to be in the right place at the right time. Here I've mentioned financial education in places where you might expect education, such as schools or workplaces. But I also know from traveling around and talking to people that they deliver financial education in airports in Azerbaijan. They deliver it in taxi ranks in South Africa. So if you've got a captive audience, if people are bored and they don't have a lot to do, and you can put an exciting little video with a few messages in front of them, it's an opportunity to reach people. So think about where people are open to watching and listening and thinking in a different way, perhaps. And then try to think about ways in which you can actually encourage people. Adults don't like to learn necessarily. They've left school. They don't necessarily want you to say, okay, this is important, please listen. What they want is to feel as though they're getting something from it, that they're interacting with something, and that they're changing their own lives for the better. So use all of the behavioural insights that you can possibly get your hands on. Think about the ways in which other areas of life have helped people to change their behaviours, whether it's in terms of diet or sport or the way social media has changed people's lives. Think about what you can do to encourage people to want to learn more, to want to continue, to want to just become a little bit more resilient than they were. And that's not necessarily content, it's really much more about delivery and about enthusiasm. But of course, content is important as well, and we have some core competency frameworks to help you think about content, but it is also important that the content reflects the needs of the target group you're trying to work with. And then I would say that if you're thinking about designing a project or a program and you have a limited budget, which most people do, it's a good idea to pilot. Even if you want to have a big launch and you want to say, oh, we're going to reach 100,000 people this year, it's probably better to have already started very low-key, had a pilot, seen where the weaknesses are, seen where the strengths are, understood what people liked and what they didn't like. If it was supposed to be 3 weeks, were they still turning up on the third week, or were they all giving up after the first week? Do it on a small scale before you launch into something big. And design your evaluation while you're doing it so that you really have the data you need before people go into their education. So here's just a little circle of some of the things that people have told us that practically you should think about when delivering financial education. In a way, I've already discussed them, but just to think about the practicalities. So understanding the barriers to financial education, knowing about the specific characteristics of your target audience, identifying the right people to train them, having the right type of intervention, and ensuring that you're monitoring and evaluating what you do. So, I'm almost finished. I do actually have a lot of slides, but I'm going to go through them quickly because what I would just want to do now is to highlight that a lot of the thoughts that I've hopefully put in your mind or reminded you are important. You can actually also find the solutions from the work that we've done with our network so far. We have a lot of tools, we have a lot of publications that I think will help you to tick the boxes in terms of the 4 bullet points that I gave you earlier. So, for a start, we've done a lot of work on measuring. We've created a survey instrument that you can use. You can adjust it to your needs. You can also use it and supply the data to the OECD, and we can include it in our international comparisons. And we do publish reports on international comparisons quite regularly these days. So, for example, this slide is just showing you the results in terms of financial knowledge, attitudes and behaviour across a wide range of countries that have used our survey instrument. And you might say, oh, but that's not really going to be able to help me with the national strategy. But what you have to remember is that within each country, you have data on the population. So, for example, you have data on gender. You have data on lots of other things as well, but gender, we know, is one of the things that we have to think about. One of the things I like to stress is that whatever you're doing, whether it's evaluation, whether it's program design, think about the gender element, because it's quite obvious sometimes that people just assume that men and women are going to learn in the same way, or they're going to be encouraged by the same type of course, or that they're going to have the same needs, and actually none of those things are true. So starting off by looking at your data in terms of gender is quite useful. The bars that are darker coloured are the countries where there's a significant gender difference in terms of financial. And a second slide just to show that we can look at the data in different ways. This is a question asking both men and women whether they would need to rely on their spouse or partner to fund their retirement. And I don't think it will surprise you much to find that women are much more likely to have to rely on their partner during retirement, sadly. We also have data for young people. We have the PISA option. PISA has been running a financial literacy option since 2012. This gives countries the opportunity to understand what's going on in schools. This graph shows you the difference in levels of financial literacy across the countries that participated. And what we like to stress is that the length of those bars also shows you the variety of financial literacy within a school. So when you're working with adults, you're working with people who've left school with no financial literacy and some that have left school with very high level of financial literacy. But scarily, there are a lot of people leaving school with almost no financial literacy, despite the fact that they nearly all have access to financial products at the age that we do this PISA assessment. So they need it, but they don't necessarily have it. And they are learning blind because they are having the practical experience without the knowledge to back it up. And while we see that practical experience is beneficial, it's not necessarily the only thing that they should have. So we've done a lot of work on digitalization as well, and we're continuing to do this. We'll have some recommendations. So if you find that digital products is one of the issues you want to address, or indeed the digital provision of financial education, we have some tools. We also have this rather boring looking list of recommendations and instruments. And again, this is particularly of interest to policymakers because you might feel that you need to be able to say there is an existing OECD policy instrument on financial education for women and girls. If you need to say that, then please do come and have a look because chances are we will have such an instrument. We do a lot of research. We are a research organisation in many ways. We rely on data. So again, if you're thinking, oh, well, I'd like to know what's happening in a particular region, or I'd like to know more about what the OECD thinks about credit and financial education, please do have a look at our research, including frameworks, including handbooks to give you better advice. And it sounds like we've done a lot, but we know we still have a long way to go. We're just in the process of writing our programme of work for the next 2 years. I have a feeling we should put insurance on it. I've noticed I get invited to insurance conferences frequently, so I feel that this is a need. It's not on this slide, though, but we will continue with policy standards. We will continue with digitalisation. We'll also bring the research community ever closer, and again, I see that this is a need, so I'm glad I do have that on my slide. We'll continue to look at the target groups. I've mentioned you've mentioned vulnerability, but so have I. If you have any particular target groups that you think are not focused on at the moment, do let me know. We'll carry on with the regional work because it's important for countries to come together and address their similarities in a smaller environment sometimes. And emerging challenges, we like to stay, I said before, the light-footed approach I think is really important. We can write a programme of work, but ultimately, we didn't know 3 years ago that suddenly the whole world is going to be talking about digital currencies, but they are. So we need to be able to address that. And so in the future, we hope to continue with that. So I'm going to stop there. As I say, my email address is at the bottom. Please do feel free to be in touch. Thank you.
Thank you very much.